Dobar dan, pratite još jedno izdanje emisije Znam da znaš. Moje ime je Bojana Dabović, moj današnji sagovornik, gospodin Vladimir Bilcik, predsjedavajući Parlamentarnog odbora za stabilizaciju i pridruživanje sa Crnom Gorom i prije svega evropski poslanik. Mr. Bilcik, good afternoon and thank you for your time for Gradska television.
Very good day, dobar dan. Greetings from Brussels. Very pleased to be here and to talk to you.
Let's start then. So the list of candidates for judges for the Constitutional Court has been established. An agreement has not yet been reached regarding the fourth candidate from minorities. This plenary session is scheduled for February 27th. All this indicates that the deadlines set by the EU have not been respected again. What is Brussels' response to all of this?
Look, Montenegro needs to move. It needs to find its own answers to the problems the country is facing. There is no institution, no person, no power, no decision-making body here in Brussels that will prepare or make those decisions. This is all in the hands of the politicians in Podgorica. I was very pleased to meet 4 MPs yesterday who were in Brussels as part of the Citizens' Assembly, and we discussed very informally the situation in the country. And I was encouraged by not only this conversation, but also the news which came from Montenegro, namely that there seems to be a broad agreement on, I understand, as many possibly as 4 candidates for the new judges in the Constitutional Court. And of course, I, together with other politicians who are engaged and working closely in Montenegro, welcome this news and also encourage the Parliament to have a sitting as soon as possible. This is a matter of urgency, so the Constitutional Court is in place. Ideally is fully in place with all 7 judges in the run-up to the presidential elections. And of course, it's been months now since the local elections, which have not been validated. There are a number of issues in the pipeline which remain controversial, including the amendments on the law of the president, which we criticized heavily. And I think it's really long overdue that Montenegro has a functioning constitutional court. And I hope that by the end of this month, at the latest, there can be a clear move in that direction. We would, of course, welcome this. As you're asking me, is this long overdue? Yes, it is. But can there be a solution? Yes, there can. And this is the most important news. So good news, good sign. And again, only dialogue, only consensus, only understanding, which engages the opposition and the governing majority in a direct conversation and agreement which surpasses the political lines in the parliament is the only way forward, because of course Montenegro needs a constitutional majority for this decision, and it would be ideal if the judges received as wide as possible the support in the parliament, because that'll give the constitutional court a broad legitimacy as well for coming years.
Some analysts claim that the judges of the Constitutional Court will not be elected on February 27th. What could be the consequences of Montenegro in that case, if that happens?
Let's discuss it after the 27th of February. I don't speculate. Look, the deadline is very clear, the plan is very clear, and I hope on the 27th of February, at the latest, there is an answer.
Mm-hmm. Considering that the parliamentary majority in Montenegro persistently ignores most of the recommendations of Brussels, in other words, government clearly does not take the warnings that come from those addresses seriously. Is there any other approach to force the government in technical mandate to fulfill its obligations under its jurisdiction?
Look, we've sent very clear messages over the past months, and the fact that now there's a deal on possibly as many as 4 names to fulfill and fill up the empty vacancies in the Constitutional Court is a good sign. So I think the messages which are sent from Brussels are, in my view, clearly understood and echoed also across Montenegro. Time is of the essence here. Much of it has been lost. And of course, we want the country to move. And it can only move with fully and credibly established institutions in place. As we've said, the Constitutional Court's appointment is an important, but certainly not the only step that the European Union institutions are asking from our Montenegrin partners to work on for progress in the EU accession path.
After speculations that Brussels could suspend negotiation or activate the balance clause with Montenegro, the minister and the coordinator of the Ministry of European Affairs of Montenegro, Ms. Ana Novaković-Đurović, after a meeting in Brussels with the Commissioner for Enlargement, Mr. Oliver Varhelyi, informed the public that the EU is not thinking about any sanctions against the government in technical mandate. Do you think that the government of Montenegro takes seriously the recommendations it receives from you?
I think clearly the only institution which at the moment has the full legitimacy and the full power to move things in the direction of the European path is Montenegro's parliament. And I'm pleased to see that the parliament is acting, that the actors in the parliament, both in the governing majority and the opposition, have taken up the calls and the messages seriously. There seems to be a deal on the appointment of the Constitutional Court, and that is extremely important. It's important that Montenegro has this institution in place. It's important that the presidential elections are well prepared, they are free and fair, and all candidates who decide to run can run in an environment which provides for free and fair campaign and elections. And I've said it on a number of occasions, and I'm happy to repeat it as well. The government, which is still carrying out its function, lost power, lost the support of the parliament in August last year. And I'm convinced that the only credible way out of this crisis and the only credible way to build a new momentum for progress in European integration is to have also an agreement on new parliamentary elections.
But we somehow don't get that agreement. How do you comment on that?
Well, the message is clear. I'm pleased that there is an agreement on the new appointments for the Constitutional Court. Clearly, that seemed even weeks ago impossible. Suddenly, it is possible. So things which politically seem not imaginable, I think, are all imaginable. And it's important that the political actors and the forces in the country work on the basis of what is at the moment the most legitimate institution in the country, namely the parliament. And the political parties in parliament have a wider responsibility than just day-to-day politics. It is the strategic direction of the country. And I hope the direction can be based on democratic processes, on legitimate decisions in line with the Constitution. And the appointment of the judges to the Constitutional Court is an important test. And if this is possible, I think all other issues are also possible. We've said it, and this is not my statement, but in the EU institutions repeatedly. I think everyone in Montenegro knows what has to be done to see progress on the EU path. The task is to do it. And the recent days and hours show that these things are doable. So just as we see that there is an agreement on this issue, there is a clear pathway towards presidential elections. And there may be some more clarity in coming weeks on also controversial issues related to the past, laws which could not be judged by the Constitutional Court because it was not functional. All of these things can be resolved fairly quickly, and I think that also paves a clear political space for Montenegro's future legitimate political government based on a fresh mandate, which is going to be handed out by voters. I think it's all, again, in the hands of the Montenegrin politicians. And it is important that progress is made. Of course, European Parliament will, at some point this year, start working on the report on Montenegro as well. Tomorrow, we are speaking tonight or today on Wednesday. Tomorrow, we are going to be discussing the reports on Serbia and on Kosovo in the Foreign Affairs Committee. I think Montenegro deserves a good report, but that report can only reflect progress which is made on the ground. And of course, the Commission will present its report in the fall, and I hope by then all of those problematic issues which we have been discussing with our partners in Montenegro for the past few months can be resolved, and we can see tangible progress. Because, as I said, there is a real window of opportunity when it comes to enlargement. And Montenegro is in the best position to make progress. And at the moment, what is stopping that progress is inaction and inability of politicians to make and take important decisions.
We clearly understand your messages, but sometimes we receive one kind of messages from you and the other kind of messages from, for example, Mr. Varhelyi. How much confusion do you think in society is created by inconsistent attitudes and messages that we receive from Brussels?
I think the European Union is, broadly speaking, sending very clear and very compatible messages. And if you want to study nuances, you may study nuances, but the message is very clear. Namely, we all want Montenegro to progress. That progress is only going to be possible once certain decisions are taken by the politicians in Montenegro. And that's a message you will hear from the European Parliament. It's a message you will hear from the Commission. It's a message you also clearly hear from member states, including the very engaged envoys who were in Montenegro recently on behalf of all 27 member states, namely the foreign ministers Fajon and Schallenberg. We are all coordinating and talking to each other, and the messages, I think, are very, very clear. Also from the EU delegation in Podgorica, don't study tiny details and emphasis in the tone. I think what is important is to take away the main message, and it's the fact that unfortunately Montenegro has lost very valuable time. It has not progressed on the EU path, but that progress is quickly possible if the country does a number of domestic political homeworks. We are ready to be engaged and to help with those homeworks. But of course, those decisions can only be taken by politicians in Montenegro. So the ball is in the hands of Podgorica, and we are happy to be engaged, to talk, to have a dialogue. But it also has to be meaningful. It has to be meaningful in the sense that let's talk when we have an agenda which we can advance together.
Yeah, I think it is important that you clarify those messages and the position of the European Union regarding Montenegro for all the society of Montenegro. So thank you for that. It is speculated that in case of a non-election of the judges of the Constitutional Court, that the president of the assembly, who comes from the party that did not pass the census in the last local elections in Podgorica, could take over the duties of the president of Montenegro. How would the EU react in that case?
Look, I'm not going to speculate once again. Let's talk about this at the end of February. But the general point is, we in Europe, in the European Union, we live in democracies. And the principle of democratic governance is based on legitimate power and legitimate division of power between the legislative branch of power, the executive branch of power, and the judicial branch of power. I mean, that's the essence of democracy. And all of those institutions have to be in place on the basis of legitimate and independent mandate from voters, from the institutions which are responsible for votes and the filling of spaces in these institutions, and any solutions which are solutions which are not based on these processes and which have to do with the fallback options are an indication of a crisis. This is why we have said Montenegro is going through a political, a constitutional and an institutional crisis, because several institutions are not either legitimate or fully in place. So it would be unfortunate if that crisis deepened. And this is why I'm saying, let's talk after the 27th of February. I hope by then there is a clear, good, democratic and European answer. And I was encouraged, quite frankly, by also the informal conversation here in Brussels with 4 MPs who happen to be here to support the project of the Citizens' Assembly, which we from the European Parliament have been working on since 2021 with Skupština. And I hope that that spirit of understanding that this is serious, this is the crunch time, will prevail, and the country will start delivering some answers.
Okay. Once again, we can hear stories about the reconstruction of the government that was voted non-confidence, which is a legally unprecedented case in the political practice of democratic countries. Would the EU have a unique positions in terms of non-recognizing that government, as the USA clearly announced?
Look, I said it very clearly. The only way out of this, there have been so many attempts to reconstruct the government, but the only way out of this is to have a politically legitimate government. And if this is not possible on the basis of the existing parliament, which clearly is the case, since there have been so many failed attempts by now, then the fair way out is to have elections. So this is the message, which is, again, not just my message. And I hope that alongside the attempts to fill the vacancies in the Constitutional Court and to organize free and fair presidential elections, there can soon be a broad political agreement and a deal on early parliamentary elections. I think it would be good also for a fresh and clean start in our discussions with our partners in Podgorica at all levels and all institutional points of engagement when it comes to really making true progress on an EU path. And let the voters decide, free and fairly. And I'm sure it's going to be it's going to be probably a very different parliament from the current one. But I hope that Parliament can produce a sustainable and a pro-European and democratic and legitimate majority, because that is the only thing which I believe also the majority of the citizens in Montenegro want. The percentages of those who want the country in the EU is consistently high, close to 80% or there around. And this is why it's important that there are also political processes which reflect that, and it's extremely difficult and unusual to foresee how a government, which is no longer a real government because it lost political legitimacy in August 2022. Can still be in place in coming months of 2023 or even beyond. That indeed would be an added difficulty, and already is an added difficulty when it comes to proper management of anything which has to do with the citizens in democratic Montenegro, but also anything which has to do with real progress on the EU path.
As we mentioned before, presidential elections are scheduled for March 19th. There are serious doubts based on the experience of previous local elections in several Montenegrin municipalities that Serbia will actively interfere in the electoral process of a country that is a member of NATO. Why has Brussels turned a blind eye to Serbia's interference in the internal affairs of Montenegro, and in the case of these elections, will it continue to do so?
Brussels is not turning blind eye to anything, quite frankly, and we will be ready to also observe these elections if we are invited once the process is in place. Also, the European Parliament will be ready to be in place and to observe, and OSCE will be in place. We have always said, and we will continue to say, and this is also clear in my report on Serbia, mutual good neighbor relations, mutual respect for the neighbors, reconciliation of difficult issues from the past, all of these are extremely important. We are also very vigilant when it comes to interference from third countries beyond the region, including Russia. And of course, we will be watching this very, very closely. Disinformation, foreign interference are a problem for democracies in this day and age, especially as we continue to face Russia's brutal aggression against Ukraine. And I hope that the elections in Montenegro will be free and fair and without major interference from any outside forces. This is not just the neighboring country to the north, but any outside forces, quite frankly. And this should be the best way forward. So I hope this is the case. We will be monitoring the situation, and the EU has never turned a blind eye to this because we are keen to see free and fair political competition. But again, let me put it this way. This is also about the strength and the independence of all democratic institutions, the strength and the independence of all political actors and parties in the country which will take part in these elections, in any elections. This is about the strong institutional foundations. That is the only way to reinforce resilience of democracy in any country, including Montenegro. So I hear these remarks quite often. And let me just say that the EU is not an omnipotent force overlooking everything. The EU is a club of mature democracies, and we want Montenegro to be that mature democracy. And I know it is a process. The country has had a difficult past, and it's been independent since the referendum in 2006. And of course, there is a point of maturity which the country will reach formally in 2024, being 18. So it's every election is a test of the maturity, but it's important that with every election there is a greater sense of the fact that the country is standing on its own, the political forces are standing on their own, and there are strong institutional democratic foundations. And this is where the EU can be helpful in the run-up to any elections as well. We have our own institutions which are monitoring the hybrid threats. We have our own training facilities which can help empower the authorities across Montenegro to be better prepared to also deal with the threats. We are already working closely with Montenegrin authorities to confront different cyber threats and possible cyber attacks. And of course, it's again important that those who will be in charge of organizing these elections are closely in touch with the various actors in the EU and across the EU. Because what matters is what happens before the elections, what happens in the run-up to elections, what happens to prevent any interference. It's very difficult to deal with the issues once they happen. So I'm glad you're raising this issue because it is an important issue. But once again, let's also be clear that the successful organizations of the elections in Montenegro are majorly and almost exclusively and purely in the hands of the authorities in Montenegro. And I have full trust in the fact that that you can manage. And we are happy to be helpful.
Yes, so we don't have a lot more time till the end of this show, but I have a few more questions. So some domestics and regional analysts and journalists are known to say that the political and diplomatic representatives of our Western partners are often benevolent towards the violation of European values and principles in the countries of the region. How do you respond to this type of criticism?
I'm not going to speculate. Let the analysts do their jobs. I think we, as politicians, we have our responsibility, and we must do our job as diligently and as responsibly as possible. And that's my job. And I'm going to continue to do my job as well as I can. And I will speak up anytime I feel that there is a problem, there is injustice. I think this is the task of politicians. But again, I would also encourage everyone to look at the fact that 80 to 90% of the answers to Montenegro's problems, including the challenges connected with elections, with the EU path, are within Montenegro. They will not come from the outside of the country. And the EU is always ready to help empower the forces which are ready to work with us. And so I hope we see more and more of those forces in important areas of decision making.
Okay, if you allow me, I would like to ask you to give us a comment about the negotiation process between Kosovo and Serbia. Can you give us a few remarks about that?
We are watching it very closely. The dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina, I think, has come to an important crossroads. I was in Belgrade just over a week ago. And of course, we are also talking closely with Miroslav Lajčák, who is the special representative for the dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina. And I'm encouraged by the news we hear, both from Belgrade and Pristina. And I just hope that these news can materialize into clear steps which will lead to results. And those results can only be successful if there is a normalization of relations based on a legally binding agreement which is signed by both sides and which is respected by both sides. So there is a lot of political work ahead on both sides, but reconciliation is the only way forward. There is too much of the legacy of the 1990s still hanging over the heads of much of the region and the people in the region. That's why there is so much mistrust, there is so much suspicion, there is so much search for enemies, problems, and also finger pointing at others, including those outside the region. And I can understand that. I can understand the emotions. I sympathize with that. That war of the 1990s was a terrible war. And the best news for the region more broadly would be if the relations between Belgrade and Pristina could come to terms with that tragic past.
Do you think it is a mistake that the EU appointed representatives of EU countries, if not all, but most of them, did not recognize Kosovo's independence and as negotiators or supervisor of the negotiation process between Serbia and Kosovo? Can it be understood as rooting for one side?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Miroslav Lajčák has the full support of all 27 member states. He has the full support of the European Parliament. He has the full support of people working across the EU institutions. I think he has earned the support and the trust of all the relevant stakeholders, both in Belgrade and in Pristina. He has a full support of the special envoys from the different member states, which are also engaged directly in these talks. And of course, he has a full support of the US. This is important. When the Europeans and the Americans work together in the Western Balkans, I think good things can come of this cooperation. I hope this is also the case here. I think that the appointment of Miroslav Lajčák has proven to be a very good appointment, and I also would express my support for his work. The dialogue cannot fail. The dialogue cannot be delayed anymore. We need to see results. There is a good window of opportunity, good window of political opportunity in coming weeks and months. And I hope there can be a basic breakthrough with initial but clear steps taken by both sides, which will calm things down and lead to the normalization of relations.
Okay, and to come back to Montenegro for the end of this show, one more question. So you work a lot regarding media and media freedoms in Europe. So the media scene in Montenegro is in a kind of domination and occupation by media from Serbia that promote the thesis of Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić and openly support political parties in Montenegro that are under his influence. After the local elections in Podgorica on October 23rd last year, the winning coalition, primarily the candidate for mayor of Podgorica, Mr. Jakov Milatović, continuously threatens to replace the management and council members of Gradska television, openly announcing, and I quote, revanchism. Is there a mechanism by which the journalists and editor of the only media that is not under the control of Belgrade and Moscow would be protected from the open attacks of the candidate for mayor of Podgorica, Mr. Jakov Milatović, and his coalition partners?
Let me put it very clearly, and this is not just a message about Montenegro, this is a broader principled message. Any thriving democracy needs strong, functioning, independent, quality-free media. And there is the answer to your question. Politicians should and must respect the independence and the freedom and the professionalism of the media. This goes for all democracies. I realize the journalists sometimes ask tough questions. I often get asked tough questions also from you and from others in the Western Balkans, but my role is to answer, is to respond. You know, this is part of being in the job in which we are. Tough questions are part of what we do, and we should have answers. Media should never be used as tools in political competition. Media should serve as a platform which is part of the free and fair backdrop for political competition. And this goes for public broadcasters. It also goes for private broadcasters. There needs to be a basic responsibility. And this is why in the European Union, we are now working on a new piece of legislation. I just became the shadow rapporteur for the largest group in the European Parliament, the EPP group. It's the Media Freedom Act. And this is a piece of legislation which I hope reinforces these principles across the European Union, because we also have our issues, our problems in the EU with the independence, quality and freedom of the media landscape. But this is why we need to also look at it and to put it in direct connection to Montenegro and others in the Western Balkans. It is also going to be a task for all the accession countries, including Montenegro, to live up to the standards of the legislation which we adopt in the EU. So once Media Freedom Act becomes a piece of legislation in the EU, of course, it'll be also a good tool for protecting the integrity of your work and the integrity of the work of all journalists. Journalists should never be intimidated, attacked, scorned. They should never be tragically killed or murdered. I mean, this is something which we witnessed also in my country, in Slovakia. It'll be just 5 years since the brutal murders of Jan Kuciak and Martina Kushnirova in Slovakia, which happened in 2017. This February, it'll be the 5th anniversary. So I am particularly sensitive to this topic. And I understand the media landscape across the Western Balkans is facing a lot of problems and challenges. But I also find it unacceptable when politicians threaten journalists and media. You should be able to do your work and ask these questions and tough questions, just like you're asking me these questions, any politician in Montenegro. And I hope you keep on operating freely and independently.
Well, Mr. Bilcik, thank you very much for the time you made for Gradska Television today. I hope my questions were not too tough.
They were perfect.
Thank you very much once again. Poštovani gledaoci, uvaženi slušaoci, bilo je to još jedno izdanje emisije Znam da znaš. Moje ime je Bojana Dabović, moj današnji sagovornik bio je gospodin Vladimir Bilcik. Hvala vam na pažnji i ugodan dan želim. Prijetno.